back to the Real News Network and our series of interviews with Gareth Porter. He's an investigative historian and journalist, and he's in our Washington, D.C. studio. And I'm Paul Jay, and I'm in a sort of makeshift studio in Maryland. Thank you for joining us again, Gareth.
Thanks, Paul.
You've been suggesting in the earlier parts of the interview that there's sections of the military who are for staying not just to 2011, but perhaps even further. And I'm wondering why they want to stay. There's going to be enormous pressure on the military to move troops into Afghanistan. Unless there's a major shift in the Afghan policy and they decide not to go in a much bigger way. So what's in it for the military to stay in Iraq any longer than they have to?
It's worthwhile to look at that question at two different levels. At the level of personally of the two field commanders in question, General Odierno and General Petraeus, you have to see that there is some difference between them. But General Odierno, first of all, has no interest in Afghanistan. That's not his concern. So he wants to maximize troop strength in Iraq because that's his overwatch, and he wants to have troops there for as long as possible because that's a measure of his clout and his success. General Petraeus, on the other hand, is concerned about Afghanistan because he's head of CENTCOM, and that is within his responsibility. But on the other hand, you have to realize that the situation in Afghanistan is so bad that there is a very good chance that anything that would be done by the U.S. military in Afghanistan would be unsuccessful. And therefore, I think Petraeus has to regard Afghanistan as a very dodgy deal in terms of military intervention. And therefore, he is also concerned about his legacy in Iraq. After all, he's identified with the idea of the surge and the alleged success that he achieved in Iraq. And he wants to see that preserved, and he wants to have, therefore, the longest possible U.S. military occupation of the country and the longest U.S. combat role in that country as possible.
One of the factors for the stabilization or instability of Iraq, according to certainly Petraeus and others, is the role of Iran. They've tried to accuse Iran of deliberately destabilizing Iraq, although when Petraeus spoke before Congress, he actually said that there's a lot of interest in Iran to a stable Iraq. And the whole issue of involving Iran in the Iraq strategy is also part of something Obama said in this speech, where he talked about the importance of regional politics. And here's what he had to say.
That leads me to the third part of our strategy: comprehensive American engagement across the region. The future of Iraq is inseparable from the future of the broader Middle East. So we must work with our friends and partners to establish a new framework that advances Iraq's security and the region's. It's time for Iraq to be a full partner in regional dialogue, and for Iraq's neighbors to establish productive and normalized relations with Iraq. And going forward, the United States will pursue principled and sustained engagement with all of the nations in the region, and that, by the way, will include Iran and Syria.
So, Gareth, is this not a sensible thing on the part of President Obama to try to have a regional solution to Iraq that involves Iran and Syria?
Well, of course, he has to have the cooperation of Iraq and of Iran and Syria. This is nothing new, of course. This has been done at least since 2006 with the Bush administration having a series of talks with Iran about Iraq. And, you know, the fact is that the Iranians have cooperated with not with the United States so much, but with the al-Maliki regime, which clearly is the Iranian main ally in Iraq and the main interest that Iran has in Iraq. And therefore, there was never any question about Iran doing anything that would destabilize the al-Maliki regime or the the Iraqi army and security services. What the Iranians did in 2007 and again in 2008 was to put pressure on the Shiite leadership, specifically on Muqtada al-Sadr, to declare a unilateral ceasefire in mid-2007, which applied to both the United States troops and to the troops of the Shiite militias who were ranged against Muqtada al-Sadr's troops and the Iraqi government. And then in 2008, when the Shiite militias, the JAM, the Jaish al-Mahdi, were again on the offensive, a counteroffensive against, this time, the Iraqi military, which had attacked in Basra. The Iranians intervened specifically to get a ceasefire and to get the Jaish al-Mahdi to stand down in Basra. The same thing happened again in Baghdad later in the year.
Right. Gareth, doesn't this, what he's suggesting here, suggest that there might even be a regional conference called, that where you would have Iran and Syria at the table, and that they're looking for a kind of grand resolution, both with Iran and with the Iraq situation? And doesn't that sound like a shift, certainly, from Bush policy?
That's an idea that would have been great in 2005, would have been a really interesting and creative and innovative, perhaps successful idea in 2005. This is 2009, and I think really history has bypassed that idea because of the Iranian policy that's already been carried out. I mean, the Iranians have already done what the United States wants them to do. And therefore, it seems to me that this is really a bit extraneous to the real situation on the ground in Iraq. It strikes me now as something that is a flourish that has more to do with sort of declaratory policy and making it look like the United States is doing something diplomatically on Iraq than really affecting the situation on the ground. I mean, the fact is that the Sunnis are going to do what they're going to do regardless of what Iran or Syria decides. They have the support of the Saudis. They have the financial support of the Saudis. They're well armed. They could carry out a war whenever they deem it desirable or necessary. And as I say, that's probably going to happen when the United States finally withdraws its troops in 2011, should it do so. So I'm not that convinced that a regional approach at this point on Iraq is really going to make that much difference in the situation on the ground.
But isn't this come down to that one way or the other, the United States really can't leave without leaving behind some kind of relatively stable political structure that's favorable to U.S. plans for the Middle East? They can't leave behind an Iraq that's going to become another anti-American state.
Well, that's not the issue, whether it becomes an anti-American state. I mean, the Sunnis cannot take power in Iraq. That's not going to happen. They are not powerful enough to take power. The last time that had any credibility was in 2005. The Shia militias defeated the Sunnis in the Battle of Baghdad, and ever since then, the Sunnis have understood that they're not going to be able to take power.
There's certainly Shias that would like to create a state which is not under the American citizenry, under American control, whether it's Sadr or others.
Well, Iraq is not going to be under American suzerainty. It's not today, and it's not going to be in the future. Iraq is going to be under a Shiite government which leans more towards Iran than towards the United States. That's a geopolitical fact that all the U.S. troops in the world are not going to change. And therefore, what I think is likely to happen is that Obama will carry out these diplomatic moves, perhaps have a conference and set up some sort of structure to make it look like he has accomplished something that he really hasn't accomplished.
Thanks very much for joining us, Gareth.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Donate today and receive a new documentary film available to members of the Real News Network. The History of the National Security State with legendary author Gore Vidal. Bonus features of the DVD include an in-depth response to Vidal from ex-CIA analyst Ray McGovern, who served under 7 U.S. presidents, an exclusive interview with Colin Powell's former Chief of Staff Larry Wilkerson, and an insightful interview with oil policy analyst Antonia Juhas.
The news magazine of the screen. Living glimpses of history in the making.
Hollywood and Washington is a symbiotic relationship. They both deal with illusions. Reality doesn't often play much of a part. I think I saw through the myth of the Cold War almost from the beginning. I was a Washington political kid from a political family. Roosevelt first had radio because he had this great speaking voice and everyone liked to hear. Truman proceeded to break every arrangement that Roosevelt had set up for a peaceful coexistence. And Truman thought that it would be a good idea. Why not just stay armed all the time? And then he devised the national security state. You've got to go up and swear allegiance to the United States or else you're a commie. I mean, we had imported fascism. We get Dwight Eisenhower, who said that we have this great military industrial complex. It is a dangerous thing. And he said this is going to change everything. And the way our country's governed is going to change us politically. Along comes Jack Kennedy, who wanted to make his mark, believed in the Cold War. But he said, in this kind of politics, it is the appearance of things that matters. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. The national security state still exists, only it isn't communism anymore, it's terrorism. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States. Knowledge is power. We need an honest news system.
We need the real news.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Make a tax-deductible donation now of at least $10 a month or a one-time give of at least $75. As a thank you for your support, we will send you the new documentary film, The History of the National Security State.